All right, here's a number worth sitting with. Over 2.3 trillion. That's what the West has spent on foreign aid over the past 5 decades. And in that same period, global poverty has fallen dramatically. Hundreds of millions of people have moved out of extreme poverty. Child mortality is down, literacy is up. By almost any material measure, the world is better off than it was 50 years ago. So the system is working, right? Here's the problem. When researchers and independent evaluators look closely at the specific projects that make up that 2.3 trillion, the NGO programs, the World Bank initiatives, the bilateral contracts, the failure rate sometimes approaches half. We're talking about 50%. And the question nobody's asking loudly enough is this: if projects are failing at that rate, why does the sector keep designing them the same way? Here's the story the sector tells about project failure. When a development project doesn't work, the diagnosis is almost always some version of the same thing. The context was too complex, the political environment was unstable, the implementing partner lacked capacity, the timeline was too short, the funding ran out before results could materialize. Notice what all of those explanations have in common. The problem is always out there in the community, in the governance environment, in the volatility of the context. The organizations that designed and funded the projects are positioned as well-intentioned actors, limited by circumstances that are beyond their control. And then comes the reporting, the end of project summaries, the case studies curated for the annual report, the beneficiary counts and the training tallies assembled with a lot of care. Global development organizations are very good at showcasing their best projects, pointing to lives improved, positive change achieved. What the sector is far less inclined to do is ask a simple but very crucial question: what went wrong? That silence is not accidental, it's structural. And understanding why it exists is where we need to start, because it's the reason development projects keep failing in the same ways, decade after decade, even as the language around them evolves a little bit. Now let's look at what the evidence actually shows across 4 dimensions. First, the failure is widespread, documented, and quietly acknowledged inside the sector itself. Some research finds that fewer than half of the World Bank projects in Africa receive positive evaluations. An analysis of project completion reports from the International Fund for Agricultural Development found that the majority of claims about results were not explicitly supported by evidence. And this is the self-reported data drawn almost exclusively from the agencies providing the aid and funding the projects. The figures almost certainly overstate success. The real picture is likely worse. Second, the incentive structure actively works against honesty. In a sector that tends to reward good news with more funding, organizations can be very reluctant to admit shortcomings, let alone outright failure. This isn't individual dishonesty, it's just structural. The current system rewards visibility and short-term results over long-term impact. Organizations are incentivized to preserve their existence rather than work toward their obsolescence, which is what we should be doing. Risk aversion operates at every level, from individual career concerns to institutional reputations. The cost of perceived failure routinely outweighs the benefit of genuine learning and innovation. Third, accountability runs in the wrong direction. Accountability in practice has emphasized upward and external accountability to donors, to headquarters, to the next funding cycle. Downward accountability to the communities projects are supposed to serve remains structurally underdeveloped. In humanitarian operations, just 1.2% of international humanitarian funding goes directly to refugee-led organizations. That single figure tells you almost everything you need to know about where power actually sits. 4, and this is the finding that should change how we think about all of this: the failure rate has almost nothing to do with how difficult the context is. Research from thousands of World Bank and Asian Development Bank projects found that country-level factors, political instability, governance environment, economic conditions, account for only 10 to 15% of the project's outcome. The specific internal actors of implementation play the crucial role. The problems are inside the system, not outside of it. Here's the tension I want to name directly because the honest version of this argument requires it. Global poverty reduction since the 1990s is real. It's one of the most significant development stories of the past century. If you're making the case that the aid model is broken, you have to reckon with that. And here's how the evidence asks us to reckon with it. The poverty reduction came overwhelmingly from domestic economic growth, particularly in China and India, two countries where the foreign aid project model played a very limited role relative to their own policy decisions, trade integration, and political transitions. Where targeted, evaluated aid has worked, specific health interventions, vaccine delivery, oral rehydration therapy, it has been precisely where the projectization problem is least severe. It's a little discrete, it's measurable, technically defined, and community accessible. So here's the contradiction. The sector points to global poverty reduction as evidence the model works. But the evidence suggests the reduction happened despite the dominant model, and that the places where projects most reliably fail are exactly where top-down, externally designed, donor-accountable programming is most concentrated. The persistence of this failure pattern suggests that the problem is not a lack of knowledge, it's the structure and culture of the aid system itself, one that has learned to produce the appearance of change while resisting the conditions that produce actual change. Here's how I read this. What we call project failure in development is often not a project management problem. It's a power problem dressed up as a technical one. James Ferguson identified this in his landmark study of a failed development project in Lesotho back in the 1990s. Development agencies consistently translate blatantly political decisions about resource allocation into technical solutions to technical problems. 3 decades later, that observation that he made remains accurate and largely unaddressed. The structure that's missing is not a better log frame, it's genuine accountability, not upward to donors but downward to communities. Aid agencies routinely collect feedback from communities on specific projects, but there's no mechanism to ensure they act on it. Consultations are held, meetings are convened, input is gathered and filed, and then structural decisions proceed as planned. What makes this especially difficult to name is that people running these projects are often skilled and genuinely motivated and working hard within real constraints. The problem is not individual competence, is that the incentive architecture doesn't really reward honesty about failure, doesn't reward learning from community feedback, it doesn't reward the slow, non-linear, hard to attribute work of genuine change. Over decades, appearing to succeed has become the product. So here's the reframe. The question, why do development projects fail, has a real answer. But the more important question, the one the sector avoids, is this. Why does the system keep failing in the same ways, with the same explanations, and then design the next project as if it learned something new? The answer is that learning requires accountability. And accountability requires that the people most affected by the work have genuine power to shape and stop it. Right now, that power doesn't really exist in most projects. Communities fill out surveys and attend focus groups, reports are filed, but decisions were already made. But here's what the evidence also shows. This is not inevitable, it's a design choice. The practitioners most effectively addressing this are doing something very specific. They're treating learning itself as the measure of quality, not the outputs. They're building iteration into the proposal, not just the post-mortem. They're measuring community-defined progress alongside donor-friendly indicators. And they're asking from the very first conversation, whose knowledge is being centered and who holds the pen? As one community leader put it simply, Don't just leave me with reports, leave us with the ability to decide. That's not a slogan, it's a structural specification. So what does this mean for practitioners navigating these realities from inside the system? 1. Embed learning into proposals as a given, not an afterthought. Budget for adaptation from day one, not as a contingency line, but as a core methodology. Built-in decision triggers, like pre-agreed points where teams review community feedback and decide whether to pivot or to scale or to stop. When learning is structurally expected rather than selectively permitted, the incentive to hide failure begins to shift. This is a small step, but a very significant one. 2. Push toward honest measurement, not just compliance measurement. The sector's dominant monitoring and evaluation system privilege quantitative indicators and donor-friendly outputs over community-defined progress. Techniques like most significant change and outcome harvesting offer a very different approach, working backward from actual changes people experience, letting communities co-analyze what those changes mean, and then sharing findings back in formats that people who contributed the data can actually access. The standard is not that we hit our targets, it's can communities see themselves in the evaluation. 3. Name the political when the system wants you to call it technical. When a project design ignores local knowledge, when donor priorities override community needs, when a budget concentrates 90% of resources at the international level, while local partners carry the heaviest implementation risk, these are political decisions. Calling them logistical constraints or adjustments removes them from scrutiny. Naming them accurately is the first step toward accountability. 4. Advocate for downward accountability, not its performance. Community feedback mechanisms are widespread. Community power over decisions is rare. The difference is whether community input can actually stop a project, change its design, or reallocate its resources. Consultation that cannot produce those outcomes is not accountability. It's the appearance of accountability. And the sector has become very good at producing that appearance. 5. Reward small, honest change over claimed transformation. The pressure to overstate impact comes directly from the pressure to secure the next funding cycle. Countering it means building a different narrative about what success looks like, one that honors ripple effects or recognizes that impact is nonlinear and hard to attribute, and takes seriously the evidence that locally led initiatives with genuine community ownership tend to sustain themselves precisely because they don't need external validation to continue. And here's a field question I want to leave you with. Think about a project you've been part of or observed closely that didn't produce the change it promised. Who was accountable for that outcome and who actually paid for it? If the answer to those two questions points to different people, the gap is exactly where the work begins. Now let's bring it all together. Development projects fail at high rates. The evidence has existed for decades, and the causes are not primarily contextual, they are structural. Incentive systems that reward the appearance of success over honest learning, accountability that flows upward to donors rather than downward to communities, and then a persistent tendency to treat fundamentally political questions about power and resource allocation as if they were technical problems with technical solutions. Global poverty has fallen, and that matters immensely, but the evidence consistently points to domestic economic development and targeted, evaluated interventions as the drivers, not the large-scale, externally designed project model that consumes the bulk of development resources. The contradiction isn't a reason for cynicism, it's a reason for precision about what types of development engagement actually work, for whom, and then under what conditions. These failures remain unaddressed not because solutions are unknown, it's because the problem sits in the very structure and culture of the aid system itself. Changing that requires practitioners that are willing to name what's broken from inside it and who have the tools to design differently within the real constraints they face. That's exactly what the Decolonizing project design ebook is built to support. It takes the structural critique you've just heard and brings it into practice, stage by stage, not as a checklist to satisfy a donor, but as a guide to making conscious, equity-oriented choices within the constraints you actually have, asking whose knowledge we're centering, whose voices we're amplifying, and how to tip the balance just a little more toward communities holding the pen. If this raised something for you, if you've seen the gap between what a project promised and what it delivered, and wonder what you could actually do about it, the ebook is the next step. Link in the description. And that question I left you with about accountability and who bears the cost, I'd love to know what came up for you. Drop it in the comments. This is Beyond Social Science, where we focus on practical learning for global change makers. If you learned something new today, I'll see you in the next video.